You are here to attend AI and Evidence-Based Guidelines, Streamlining Prior Authorization for Medical Necessity, presented by MCG. This is part of the Hearst Health Network. I have Brandy O'Diam, who is the Director of Product Management for MCG Health, and Danny Cawood, who is the Manager of Product Management for MCG Health. Let's welcome them.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Welcome to the session with the shorter title. My name is Danny Cawood. As she said, this is Brandy O'Diam. We are from MCG Health. Brandy, if you want to advance us here. Some of you may know us by our old name, Milliman Care Guidelines. That's what MCG used to stand for. Hearst Health bought us in 2012. We're no longer affiliated fully with Milliman, so now we're just MCG. We have nearly 7,000 clients. We have a majority of the health plans in the United States, as well as about pretty close to half of the hospitals in the United States use our criteria for medical necessity review as part of the prior authorization process. So we do a lot of work, Medicaid, Medicare Advantage. We do a little bit of work with Medicare fee-for-service as well. So one of our folks, Raj, he was on the original agenda. He is a WEDI board member. He was unable to be here this week. He also serves on the HITAC committee. We are HITRUST certified. We're very involved in the Da Vinci work group under HL7. So we're very involved in this prior authorization space. We're here to talk a little bit about the hot topic of the year and really the end of last year and this year has been all about AI, ChatGPT. We've heard a lot about AI. We are in that slot right after lunch. We'll do our best to keep everybody awake. Stay with us. We're not going to have you stand up and do a jumping jack or anything, but hopefully we will keep you interested and we'll leave some time here at the end for Q&A.
So we all know that the current authorization process is problematic for everyone involved. Payers, providers, and patients all suffer from it. It's labor intensive and timely, which sometimes creates delays in patient care. And this, of course, leads to frustration and anxiety and sometimes impacts their health. It's also costly to both the providers and the payers. Payers spend a lot of time trying to obtain the clinical information that they need to complete the review. Sometimes they get not enough information, and there's frequent attempts to reach out to the provider to collect that information, and sometimes they get too much information, so hundreds of pages of documentation that they need to sort through in order to complete the review. Providers also struggle with the process. They have to if they're using portals, they have to maintain multiple portal logins for all the payers. For all the payers, they have to know whether or not an auth is required for a service. They have to know what the payer expects whenever they're submitting the auth for the particular service. So it's painful for everyone. The AMA actually made a statement around providers in the prior authorization process being burdensome for the most burdensome process with payers, spending an average of 13 hours of staff time per week on 41 authorizations per physician.
And obviously, the industry has been extremely focused on this. The industry has been focused. We've heard from a few different folks today. I think the HCSC team just presented right before lunch on this. The government has also been very, very focused on this year and last, and really for the last 3 years. So CMS at the end of last year, buried the lead right before Christmas and released a proposed rule around prior authorization, streamlining those processes using the HL7 Da Vinci Fire implementation guides for burden reduction. We're going to hear a lot about PARDD in the next few years. That did just get sent to the Office of Management and Budget a couple of weeks ago, which is one of the critical steps for it to eventually get finalized. That OMB review for that rule will also have a big standing on whether the seniors access to timely care bill in Congress passes, making a lot of that rule federal law. Those Da Vinci implementation guides are the Coverage Requirements Discovery, CRD, the Documentation Templates and Rules, DTR, and Prior Authorization Support, PAS. Going around the top, requirements, CRD, documentation, DTR, decision, PAS. So that's where PARDD is standing for. So on the requirements side, those are all the business rules. That's kind of how we refer to them. Is an authorization required? That takes into account, is the member eligible for benefits? Is the service that was actually ordered a covered benefit? We know a lot of health plans have a problem paying for or approving authorizations for services that aren't going to pay because it's not a covered benefit. Is that provider in network? Are they gold carded? All of those different types of things happen in that requirements step. DTR, if an authorization is required, present the payer documentation requirements to the provider. Allow them to know when they're done. And compile all of that data automatically into the last step, the decision, create the case in the payer system, return an authorization decision to a provider in real time. That can be a pending additional review, but give them some sort of feedback to know that that request has been received. And by the way, do all of this inside of the provider's EHR. Your portal is not going to cut it anymore, is what CMS is saying to the health plans. You need to be able to do it within the provider's EHR. On the state level, Washington has made this rule Washington state law. If you go to the next one, there's also been lots of states looking for transparency into this process. So all these states have prior authorization data reporting enacted. There's actually one or two more that did not make this slide that just did this here at the end of their legislative sessions. These are all the states that are looking for transparency into this process. If you go to the next one, there's states that are already doing something about it as well. These are all the states that have said, you have to be able to gold card providers. Again, everybody's coming at this from a little bit of a different way, trying to solve the pain that Brandy was talking about a little bit earlier. So this is just a few examples of what federal and state governments are doing on this right now.
So we have some examples of how our automation solutions have provided value to some of our customers. One payer was able to achieve 60% of prior auto-auth prior authorizations for a provider who was submitting authorizations directly from their EHR. On the other end of that, the provider is receiving an immediate decision. One of our provider clients was able to increase productivity from 3 to 5 to 12 to 5 auth requests per hour. They did this because they were receiving an immediate response on whether or not an auth was required. Prior to that, they were submitting the request to the payer via fax and waiting for a response back. So both payer and provider were having to manage those authorizations. And typically with a fax, if any of you are familiar with it, it's not just one, it's like 3 or 4 that someone's having to touch on both ends. Cleveland Clinic, I'm sure you've heard of them. They were 100% fax for this particular payer. They refused to use the portal. They were just going to fax. Once they implemented our solution, they moved to about 98% emergent inpatient admissions were submitted through the electronic submission via their EHR. Of those auths, 15% were auto-approved, so immediate decision loaded into their EHR. And then all determinations that were made after the review was completed, and this includes the, hey, I need some additional information, that came back into the provider's EHR. There was requests to the provider, hey, I need this lab work. That lab work is then submitted back through the electronic submission process, and the payer is able to utilize it to finalize the decision. The decisions are then loaded back into the EHR. University Hospital saw a 13% reduction in processing faxes, and one of our other payers saw a 9.2% 0.2% reduction in medical director referrals for inpatient medical necessity reviews. And of course, this is a huge savings because the medical director is one of the most costly individuals in the payer world. So as you can see, the problem is worth solving, and payers and providers would both benefit from solving the problem.
And if you go back just for 1 second, there is value here is kind of the story, right? So the government's saying we need to do this, right? There is value here. And from our perspective, look at this, don't look at compliance. So compliance is a nice output of this, but this is an investment as a payer and a provider in saving money, streamlining organizational processes, requirements, documentation, decision. I'll say it a few more times. Upper right, that provider requirements, 83% of what they were submitting to the payer didn't require prior authorization in the first place. Documentation, Cleveland Clinic, 15% auto approvals. They were already documenting it. That's why they refused to use the portal. We were able to use it and send it on to the payer. The decision part, either the 60% or the 9.2, whichever one you want to focus on, that's where there is value in each of those steps. It's a tremendous amount of value that people don't realize in that requirements part especially, because providers are not great at knowing whether an authorization is required, and that's not their fault. The rules are extremely complicated. Lots of little carve-outs, lots of little individual benefit plans for this employer doesn't require auth, but the rest of all of your Blue Cross Blue Shield patients do, but this one doesn't. So they don't know what they should submit. That's not their fault. We need to make it easier for them and do it from within their EHR. Go ahead. So when we think about it, I want to talk a little bit, the gentleman from Harvard who spoke yesterday, he said, throughout the prior authorization process, as long as the contracts don't change, as long as the process doesn't change very much, AI is great for it. I agree. And certain parts of this process don't change very much, and certain parts of this process change a lot and frequently. And so that's where rules-based automation and AI together can help us automate certain steps. So on the first one here, PA submissions and intake. If you do fax, that case structure in the payer's system very rarely changes, right? Yeah, so that case structure very rarely changes. AI is great for this particular step of this process. The next one, though, if you go to the next one, eligibility, benefits, in-network, out-of-network, is an authorization required? These rules change all the time. Almost, if you're a provider who has 30 different payers that you work with, you're getting a change to these probably once a day, right? This is where rules-based automation can help a lot. This is where there is still a space for rules to sort of abstract the AI aspect of this, have an abstraction layer where we can predict what exactly is going to happen, and then send it through. So eligibility benefits, they change frequently. You can probably give us some examples.
I think everyone knows the example around eligibility. Members go in and out of eligibility, or they're eligible at different times with different plans, right? I think providers are the same. Whether or not they're in-network or out-of-network is going to determine whether or not you're going to approve the request in the event it actually meets medical necessity. I'd say coverage is a really big one. If you have to count accumulators and whether or not the benefits have been consumed, the allowed number of benefits, and the line of business, and whether or not the line of business is going to force you to do a review even though they've consumed their allowed number of units or visits, whatever it may be. These do change all the time. They're not a yearly thing for sure.
Good segue. The next one is routing, duplicates, delegates. Does this go, as a payer, you may change your process for where do those requests go. Yesterday, we sent all Medicaid requests to the Medicaid team, all Medicare to the Medicare team, all commercial to the commercial team. Tomorrow, we're going to break it up by specialty, and that will help us review faster. Or we're going to go the other way, and that will help us review faster. Whatever it is, those rules also change all the time. and sometimes at the drop of a hat when there's a leadership change or a reorg. And so, again, rules-based automation where things change very frequently and they're very predictable about what it's going to be based off of if this, then that. Rules-based automation still has a big place to play here. That leads us into the medical necessity aspect of this. So when we think about policies, when we think about documentation requirements, we think about guidelines for MCG customers, looking at those attachments that the provider is submitting as a part of their process. AI has a lot of place to play here, and we probably still want a layer of abstraction between the AI and the decision. It's where some form of rules-based automation can be very helpful. And why we want that layer of abstraction. So we both came to MCG from the payer space. I worked for a very large national payer for a long time. We built a deep learning algorithm long before ChatGPT was a thing. We built a deep learning algorithm that could auto-approve specialty RX authorizations. It's extremely accurate. And to my knowledge, to this day, it is still sitting on the shelf because our MDs, medical directors, did not feel that they could describe to a jury of their peers how that decision actually got made. Whether it's it's not just for denials. If you get sued for a denial, you have to talk about all of your approvals for that same service. How'd you make those decisions? There's nothing worse than an I don't know. Same thing, there's a large national payer just was in the news about 2 months ago with a $100+ million fine for using AI to approve things they could not describe to a jury of their peers how a decision got made, or to government regulators, how a decision got made, to Medicare Advantage, how does that decision got made? The OIG hit a bunch of Medicare Advantage payers for that last year right before they issued that rule. It's one of the impetuses for that rule for prior authorization processes. So there's nothing worse than an I don't know. So what does a layer of abstraction between AI and a decision look like for medical necessity?
So here's an example of how our solution will highlight the relevant indication based off of structured data within the EHR. Specifically, I can't see it from here, but specifically, we've pulled back 2 respiratory rates that are above 18 beats per minute. And that, of course, meets the criteria for the indication of 18 beats per minute for an adult or a child 13 years of age or older. But what we're looking for, what criteria actually has to be justified here is whether or not the patient is doing well in observation care, or do they need to move on to the next level of care. And in this particular scenario for pneumonia, what we found is based on the organization, they're going to decide whether or not it's okay to just use the respiratory rates, or do they need to go in and kind of take another look and just make sure that this is what we want to submit to the payer. On the payer side, I don't know that these 2 respiratory rates, the payers we've talked to, they want to know if you can change the time frames around here. So there's question on whether or not this actually meets the criteria, like depending on the times that you've pulled in.
So on this screen, the left-hand side, or let me start actually on the right-hand side, that's the patient's medical record. On the left-hand side, that's evidence-based medicine criteria, whether that's a payer policy, in this case it's an MCG guideline, but that's a payer policy, that's something a human can read, sit down and read, and say, this is how a decision would be made. And then there's data from the medical record matched up against it that proves that this is how it did get made. So the left-hand side is that layer of abstraction, a set of rules that somebody can just sit down and read that's based off of evidence. That's your layer of abstraction between artificial intelligence and the eventual decision that can allow people to describe how it was made. This is with structured data, like Brandy said, respiratory rates. 80% of clinical information is unstructured. You can do the same thing with unstructured data, again with that layer of abstraction. So on the right-hand side, physician notes that are highlighted. On the left-hand side, documentation criteria that you can read that says if you can check this box, that box, and the other box, then it is medically necessary, and we will move it on to approval. So we took those highlights that we made, we matched them up to the criteria. This helps you, and then obviously with that, there's a one or more of the following in there. They check the one or more of the following, the entire thing is met, you move on to an approval. That layer of abstraction is very valuable for explainability of what's going on here. If all you have is a 150-page medical record with highlights and a yes or a no, and you ask a chief medical officer, a medical director to stand up and say, this is how this decision got made to an arbitration board or to a court, good luck. And that's what's happened in the market with some of these algorithms is they're like, I don't know. And that there's nothing worse than that answer. There's nothing worse, I have to imagine, from that medical director's perspective, standing up there to have to say, I don't know. So have this layer of abstraction sort of in between your artificial intelligence algorithms, have them feed into a set of rules that you can sit there and say, now we can have a conversation about, was the criteria wrong? That's happened for 20 years. People have argued about criteria. Maybe it was. Was the AI feeding in incorrect things? That's something we can fix. Much easier than going right back through the record from scratch and saying, what does this look like? This is also very helpful for audits. If you have a bunch of highlighted clinical data and a yes or a no, and you have to go back through and do an audit, you're doing net new reviews for that with humans right from the get-go. You want something structured to say, this is how this decision got made. We can show that this decision is getting made repeatedly, reliably, the same way every time, and this is why. That's where you can unlock the power of AI and let it run a little bit more freely when you can sort of see live what it's doing and how it's going. By the way, you can also put this in front of a clinician before you actually start auto-approving with this and have them start to say, I agree, I agree, I agree, I agree. You can live QA your AI algorithms doing something like this too. So this layer of abstraction, think through it. Happy to take some questions for it at the end here, but this is critical when we're thinking about using AI for medical necessity reviews. You want to add something?
Yeah, just want to touch on someone can review it and validate its accuracy. In order for a clinician to be okay with automating, at least from our experience, they have to have confidence in the solution, right? That time during that validation time, they're gaining confidence in the solution. And I think that's really important.
They're gaining confidence, and those reviews will speed up too. So the average time for one of these reviews is 15 minutes. From ACMA, I think, said 15 minutes. Our users who are doing this are doing these reviews after using it for a year in 45 seconds. So you're saving money while you are QAing your automation algorithms for the future. Both things, right? We don't want to have clinicians just start QAing this and doing nothing else. That's expensive. Have them do reviews. Speed up their reviews while you're doing it, and they can QA the algorithms as they go. So at the last step here, determinations. We've had a lot of steps in here. Determinations, AI is really good at this. Taking some really clinical language like we just flashed up on the screen, hemodynamic instability that persists despite observation. What does that mean? I don't know. I'm not a clinician by trade. She is, but I'm not. Large language models are really good at this. Take this, give it to me at a 5th or 6th grade reading level. This can be very helpful for something like approval letters, something like denial letters, those types of things. But if you go straight from submission to determination, you go through all of these steps using purely AI with all of those mushy middle steps that change relatively often, it's going to be hard to QA. You might get yourself into trouble with saying, I don't know why this thing approved and didn't pay, or why it paid and didn't approve, or this or that. We see health plans struggle with that today. I know we're running short on time, Brandy. If you skip to the very end, we'll skip this one. So automation is a journey, not a destination. Do not underestimate the power of end-user feedback as you automate certain parts of these steps. Artificial intelligence and interoperability are complementary. They are not an either-or. Because the one thing that rules-based automation AI have in common is garbage in, garbage out. So if you have bad data going in, you're going to get bad outcomes going out. So if you can use the interoperability pieces that are out there, DaVinci, I know X12 has done a lot of this work for a long time. Whatever you're using, keeping that data electronic and not letting it get flattened into a PDF or something will allow you to QA the data coming in, make it much easier to QA the decisions coming out. Michael, I don't know how we're doing on time. Am I way over? Okay. Wow. So we got a lot of time for Q&A, as long as you guys are all still awake after lunch here. Happy to take questions from either the audience or from the room.
Thanks so much. This is really interesting stuff. I was wondering, the highlighted medical record that's showing the data that are being considered, is that, it sounds like that must be retained then, both from the payer to refer back to say this is why I made the decision. Is it also being written back to the provider side so they can see what specifically the data the payer was considering in making the decision?
Yes, great question. So right now, actually, this is in provider EHRs today. That's where all this data is coming from. Providers are using this solution. This is how we are building. This is the foundation on which we are building our payer automation solutions. But yes, this is written back with the matches and the highlights and what have you into the provider's EHR today. The payer also maintains a copy of this. Again, you're doing this to go back and look at your decisions later. The yes or a no is great in the moment, right? But very often you have to go back and look at these later. That's what this is almost primarily for, because at some point, you saw it up on the screen when we showed the value. There's payers, 60% of the time, 15% of the time, whatever percent of the time, they're already automatically approving these. And they're like, yeah, we're good in the moment, but these are helpful for going back. Does that answer your question? Great.
All right, I'm gonna ask this question because you're the clinical policy gods over there with the access to all the information. So when you present the business case with the ROI, perfect. Here's how many hours you're gonna save. Excellent. But same question I asked earlier about the level of effort that's required to take all the guidelines and codify them. What is your vision on who ultimately pays that cost? Like, who's responsible for codifying everything into a beautiful CQL that people can consume? And is that a shared cost amongst the stakeholders? Is that a value prop that MCG is offering? Could you share a little bit of your point of view on that?
Sure. Good question. Tough question. So for MCG's criteria, the same clinical team that writes the guidelines, has written the guidelines since the late 80s, is doing the codification for MCG's guidelines. As it relates to, we don't do a lot of society work, but we do a lot of work with payer medical policies. So we know, especially in the elective procedure space, health plans very heavily use their own internal medical policies. I think codifying those, getting them into a pretty CQL, all of that work, it's an offering we have. I think there's opportunities to share that cost. So if you think about, I'm thinking about a couple of Blue Cross payers. They have, one of them has 450 and one of them has 800 medical policies. 400 of those are actually from the association, right? So in theory, all of the Blues could share the cost for doing that at the association level. It's not a conversation that we're having yet. I don't think we're there yet. We're still sort of, ooh, can we just auto-approve it and skip the policies altogether question? Obviously, we don't think so, and I haven't heard any. I've heard a lot of payer technologists say so. I haven't heard any payer clinicians say so yet. So I think as soon as we get past that, can we skip the policies altogether? Those conversations will start to come out. There's also I know some of the vendors out there are doing a lot of work around this as well. So ingesting your PDF policies, I'm going to codify it, I'm going to make it beautiful. Make sure you get to see what they're doing as they're doing it. But beyond that, there's different answers for that. I don't know that everybody's even on board with the idea of codifying them yet into CQL. So I think we get there and we'll have some of those conversations. It's not a perfect answer, but it's the best one I've got for you today. We do our own stuff and we offer to do it for you. And there's other vendors out there that can do it. And eventually we should have a conversation about sharing that more broadly. Like if everybody's sharing the same medical policies, if everybody's using ASAM for behavioral health, let's have that conversation. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think you have to ask the question too, is the cost of codification worth codifying the guideline, right? Like if you're only going to see 100 auths for that particular service in a given time, maybe it's not worth codifying.
And if it's
I think you have to look at high volume, low complexity to start with, and then you build on that. If it's a high dollar service and the guideline is complex, do you want to codify it? Well, depends.
And if it's a new service, it's a new drug, new procedure, new device of some sort, the criteria is going to change so often in the first couple of years, 3 years that it's out on the market. Is it worth doing it then? Even if it's high volume, if it's going to change all the time, it might be wasted. So it's a good question. I don't know if we had a perfect answer for you. It's the best one we've got right now. Go ahead.
So I'm from Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, which I think you know. I just wanted to clarify, we do not make medical policies for our plans. We can chat offline, but I just want to make sure that everyone in the room understands we do not make medical policy for our plans. That is done at the plan level.
Thank you. Great presentation. Similar to the CQL question, we've been having a lot of dialogue around BPM Plus for health to really take a lot of the stuff encoded in PDFs and make them computable as a sort of general process and make that scalable. I'm assuming nobody's sort of in that space at all as well, just like the CQL space for standardization.
There's a few, but yeah, you're right. It's nascent from my perspective right now. There are a few demonstrations out there of we can do this with CQL or we can do this with some other standard piece. You'll see the EHRs still haven't made certain things, like thinking of one EHR has not made medications available via standards-based API yet. So it's nascent. I think, again, once we get some alignment around this is how automation is going to work, there will be a lot more focus on that space. I think we've all heard CQL, we've all heard some of these different standards-based way to do CCDA. I had a conversation with somebody who was like, we should use CCDA for this. Maybe. From our perspective, it has to work for the end ROI. There is no distinct ROI from creating CQL if you can't do something with it from our perspective. So we got to figure out what we want to do with it first, and then I think there will be a lot more there. Any online, Michael? All right. Give everybody some time back. Thank you for your attention. And we'll be around for questions afterwards if you have any.